Howdy, everybody. Shasta College, November 10th, 2020. The year's winding down. Do you got plans for Thanksgiving, Christmas? It's all different this year, as you well know. I'm going to talk about two artists today. I'm still on painters. We're going to be on there probably till early next week because I want to cover some female painters also next week. No, not next week. I'll cover it this week. I keep thinking today's Thursday. It's only Tuesday. On Thursday, I'll be winding this down with female artists. Now, I hate to separate it out like that because, but they need their own section. They need to be mentioned in their own block. Like we put women in all this, writers, filmmakers. We're not quite integrated as we'd like to be, as we should be. Today, I'm going to talk about two major artists of the late 20th century that shook up the art world as well it should be. One of them was Andy Warhol. The other one was Jean-Michel Basquiat, Miguel Basquiat. But before I get to their story, I'm going to assign assignment this week, but it's going to be a little different. You're going to watch two documentaries and maybe do some research on both of these artists I just mentioned, and there's going to be a quiz. I probably won't do the quiz till later on this week because I want to make sure you guys see these movies and documentaries that I'll go find. See if I can find them with no charge to you guys, and you'll have to do some research, and the quiz will be based on essentially them. You'll have, it's the only quiz we're going to do this year. I thought, well, let's do it now. Why wait till the last week when there's too much pressure on everybody? It'll be an essay quiz because that's what I believe in essays. Critical thinking is, in my opinion, key to education. I don't care for true and false and multiple choice. People ended up guessing and they don't put in the effort. Whereas I could see in an essay that some critical thinking is taking place. And that's what I'm basing it on. And a lot of times there's no right or wrong. It's just, how do you see it? And express it to me in an essay. You'll probably have limited time to take the test, 24 hours, 12 hours, I haven't decided yet, meaning when I sign the test, you'll have 12 hours to complete it. The essay's not going to be very long. They're only a couple paragraphs, so don't worry about that aspect. We'll talk more about all the ins and outs of that probably on Thursday, not yet. So don't worry about it. I just want to tell you what's going to come up. And we're going to do a little different. It'll be the usual 10 points. And then we'll get back to the essays next week. I'm sure you're looking forward to that. Anyway, I've got the first three essays graded. Yay. I know I should be further ahead, but I'm working on it, folks. Next up, your fourth essay. I'm working on it this week. Anyway, what else? That's it. So Andy Warhol cannot stress this further. He's actually a legend. I would say he's a living legend, but he is not alive. He died. He was an icon of the art world. He came from a small town and a small neighborhood in Pittsburgh. It was not pleasant. He did not have a pleasant childhood. He was born with all sorts of maladies and a skin condition. If you know what Warhol looks like, he lost all his hair early, and he always wore wigs. But he did the brilliant thing by wearing such an exaggerated wig. It kind of looked cool. And wigs don't look cool to me, especially men with toupees who try to make it look like their real hair. But he didn't do that. He was against that. And his toupees, his wigs were rather artistically stuck on his head, and he became very known for that look. And for some reason, he pulled it off. And he had a severe skin condition where he had severe acne, severe scarring. He was very shy and shut down, but a talented illustrator and who wanted out of his hometown, which was not going anywhere. He was raised in a crappy apartment building. They didn't have a lot of amenities, hot water, for example, or all that much food. He couldn't wait to get out there and go to New York City, where dreams are made or broken. His were not broken; they were made. And he got there. When he got there, he got a job drawing commercial sketches of advertising and women's wear for department stores. And he was talented, and he was already making a pretty good living early on in New York. And you can see his drawings. It's all in this documentary. Oh, you guys are going to watch. They're well done, and they're kind of whimsical. Are they art? Not really. Are they creative art? Not really. They're just sketches of fashions, shoes, purses, etc. And of that time, we're coming out of post World War II. Remember when I've talked about this before? And he was definitely a product of post World War II because he was born in about 1929 or so. He'd be old now. He'd be 91 if he'd be alive or something like that. So he definitely came through World War II, although he was too young to go into the military. But he came to New York City right when New York City was busting with energy, creativity. We survived the war. We survived Hitler. We survived Japan. We came back feeling pretty good about being American, a democracy. Money started flowing into the tax funds, and so a lot of buildings were going on in New York City, across the country. Freeways were being built. So there was this suburbs were being built. That's where, for the first time, homeowners could buy a house if you want. Say you paid for your house on the GI Bill, which is how my father paid for his first house. And they were building houses further and further out from the city because people wanted a yard. They wanted to have a place to raise their kids and have a dog, and they felt confined in the cities. And so, but when Warhol's getting there, he didn't want to be in the suburbs. He wanted to be in the city. He was exactly where he wanted to be, where he dreamed about being. He was obsessed with beauty and celebrity and creativity and being around that. And so he did rather well for himself as a commercial illustrator for different high-end department stores in New York City, catalog work. But there was always something. He was very shut down. He was a closeted homosexual, and in those days, you stayed in the closet or you could get arrested, folks. A lot of times, homosexuality, depends on where you were, was illegal. And so if you got caught with somebody of the same sex, you could go to prison or at least be fined, and it would be in the papers, and you could be ruined because people stayed in a closet for lots of social reasons. And so he was in there. 1950s, we have the Cold War going on with Russia. The nuclear threat was always hovering above all of our heads. It was in the news every day during that time in New York. The theater was busting at the seams with revolutionary plays like Death of a Salesman and Streetcar Named Desire and Room at the Top of the Stairs and many, many others. Theater was serious theater. That's not musicals, folks. I'm talking about serious plays. Actually, were commercial. People had the patience to sit through them, not like we do now. Everything has to be fast. And they would sit through a 3 or 4 hour play by Eugene O'Neill because it was worth it. Music scene was popping. I've covered some of this stuff already, but it was jumping, man. We had jazz, we had bebop, which is a form of jazz. We had cool West Coast jazz, poetry. The writers were busting at the seam coming out of World War II. People like Jack Kerouac, which I've covered this stuff already, but you got to remember, put it in context. How these artists like Warhol flourished. What's the cultural landscape look like when this artist was creating his greatest work? That's throughout history, folks. The Beatles were creating their greatest songs, and they had been raised during World War II. They were children, but they had been bombed nightly by the Germans. Their playground was bombed out buildings. That's going to affect you. It's going to affect everything, your music, your outlook on life. And thus we had the British rock and roll invasion with the Rolling Stones et al. And all those guys who are well into their middle to late 70s now, if they're still alive, were brought up during tough times. Rationing. This is Europe now. We rationed here, but it wasn't near as tough as they did in Britain. So they're eating boiled potatoes and carrots every night. And if they ever had a piece of meat, they're fortunate. No desserts, sugar was rationed. Think about it, folks. No sweets. There's no Starbucks to save you. Very few people had cars because they couldn't afford the gas, and all in this country, it wasn't as bad, but all the funds went to fighting the war. And so gas was rationed, rubber for tires was rationed. And so a lot of people didn't have these luxuries that we do now, that we take for granted, absolutely now. That's what's happening in the United States during Warhol's time in the 50s, coming into New York City. Rock and roll starts in the middle of the 50s with Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley and Little Richard, Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly. Rock and roll, it was a new form of music that was coming out of rhythm and blues, and country and western were kind of married. And rock and roll was essentially born in black neighborhoods, black areas of the United States, and it was taken over by a different kind of beat on the drum. The 4/4 drum changed everything. Electric guitars. They didn't have electric guitars before this. Think about that. Your guitar's amplified now. You could hear it over the other instruments. That never happened before. And a whole new landscape of musicians and music was starting. This is when Warhol is there in the very beginnings of his career, and all the stuff he's seen, and the mass consumption of commercial products at the supermarket, at the drugstore, at the what we call them five and dime in those days. He'd call them Costco now. The department store that kind of sold a little bit of everything, from men's clothing to bicycles and golf clubs. Okay, so all this is happening at the same time. This is a lot, and you're in a very big city, but it's small. If you've never been in New York, please go. It's not very big. You can walk it. It's 100 blocks or so, but you can still walk it. All this is confined into this small area. We got two rivers on both sides of Manhattan Island. So that when I say New York City, I'm talking about Manhattan. I'm not really talking about so much yet. This comes into play later. The different boroughs, which would be Brooklyn or Queens or the Bronx. That's though happening, but the electricity of the art scene was happening in Manhattan. And so even people from those boroughs were moving into Manhattan to get to be a part of it. That's how important the little island, the city of New York City, confined to it, the island of Manhattan. You can actually live there really cheap. You can get an apartment for $60 a month, maybe less. They'd be a walk up. You might have to walk up 5 or 6 flights of stairs, and most of them were what they call cold water flats. They didn't have hot water, but you can always make the hot water on the tea kettle. You learn to live with this stuff if the environment is conducive to being creative. And if you want to be creative and go for it, so what if you got to boil the water in the stove? You could do it. You're tough. And so they go on the streets, and the streets are alive. There's millions of people walking on the streets, talking on the streets, meeting each other in the streets. You're looking, you're observing, you're seeing everything. It's hyper commercial consumerism of the highest order right in front of you. You don't have to travel for it. Nobody has cars in New York because there's no place to park, and so you're on foot. You're taking cabs. You're riding the bus. You're riding the subway, which is underneath the ground, folks. And there are a million people commuting to work on the subway. And then they're going out in the evenings and having the times of their lives, listening to cool music in cool bars, listening to poetry in coffee shops. They are looking at art in galleries. They are at the apex of art in America. Really comes alive in the 1950s. I mentioned already last lecture about Willem de Kooning and Jackson Pollock. They're becoming world renowned, and all of a sudden the art centers like Paris and London and Florence and Amsterdam are taking a back seat to New York. America art for first time is sweeping the world. Didn't really happen before World War II. Guys like Picasso lived in France most of his life. I don't believe he ever lived in America, but he might have stayed here a couple times. But until then, art was considered a European thing. Yes, there's Asian art, there's Chinese art, Japanese art, Vietnamese art, but we're not covering that in this. We're staying in Western cultures in this course because it's just too broad to try to include every culture out there. I do get a shout out to these people, these countries, and these non-English speakers, but mostly we're staying to Western culture. Be that as it may, please go study that other stuff because there is a plethora of incredible wonder and beauty and in literature, music, painting, just like there is here. That's happening elsewhere also. But we're kind of spoiled here. We've got some money. People aren't hurting too bad. The depression is over. We've got spendable money. We can go buy some products. We could improve our lives that way. Our consumerism. People are starting to buy TVs. TV's huge. TV in the 50s, when it was invented way back in the 20s, but it wasn't mass produced until about 1948. And by about 1953, we went from hundreds of TVs in the country to millions of TVs to where almost everybody had a TV in their house. They can afford it. Finally, a little black and white or a Zenith TV, an RCA TV. that's how we grew up with TV, and Warhol was around this. He's looking at commercials, he's taking it all in. That's what's influencing his art. Now, he's getting a little chafed and feeling tied down to this certain commercial art he's been producing. He wants to bust out. He wants to make a difference. And he thinks he's got the talent. He's driven, and he's good at meeting people. He's not shy about getting his name out there in the world. He was shy and shut down sexually. Yes, he was. And socially, but not when it came to his career. He was really good at self promotions. That really happened a lot later in the 60s. But right now, he's learning how to manipulate the press, manipulate agents, art galleries who might give him a chance to show his work. So he loved looking at a Coke bottle. He saw beauty in art and looking at a simple Coke bottle. He saw beauty in art and a frozen dinner, which then we never had those before. They used to call them TV dinners, folks, because you took them and ate them in front of the TV. All of a sudden, you can have a full meal. You can have Salisbury steak, potatoes, peas, and a dessert, all in a little tiny tray that you put in the oven for 30 minutes, and you sit at the TV and watch it on a TV tray. That's what the 50s was all about, convenience. It was helping mother, because mother's tired of cooking all those big meals. It was giving women a break from having to cook and clean. All of a sudden, everything changed. The vacuum cleaners got more high tech. They got more affordable. Cleaning supplies, dishwashers. Oh, yeah. The first dishwashers were showing you don't have to wash your dishes anymore. Pardon me, you just have to put them in the washer and it does it all for you. The future is here, and Warhol is around all of that. And so he decides he's going to paint a soup can, simple soup can. Campbell's Soup. Do you eat Campbell's? So he decided to paint each flavor of Campbell's Soup that was offered in his day. And it's different than what's offered now. You'll see. Yes, they had asparagus soup in those days. They had different flavors of soup that they don't have now, and vice versa. And he painted them as realistic as he possibly could. He's using his talent for doing commercial art and painting things in a very realistic way. And so he decided to paint the soup cans. I think originally, I think there was 36 cans. And so he made 36 paintings of each flavor from the same angle. Who would buy such a thing? What's your point? Nobody wants to look at a soup can. That's what people told him. A guy out in California, in LA, saw something special there, some form of brilliance, and he wanted to buy a couple. And in those days, I think he offered Warhol $250 a piece, and Warhol was really smart and didn't sell them. He said, "No, you don't break it up. These 36 paintings all are one. I'm not going to sell each one to different people. You either take them all or you don't take any of them." Well, the guy wasn't ready for that, but he displayed them. The big showing was out in LA, and it confused people. People didn't know what to make of it. And then writers started critiquing it. You know how I asked you guys to do your critical essays? Well, that's what the critics were doing. And they saw something. And boy, what they saw was a phenomenon. The Campbell's Soup cans now are worth, they're almost priceless. They're worth hundreds of millions of dollars as a whole, and they've been displayed in every major museum in the world. And it made Andy Warhol almost a household name overnight. Who was this strange little guy with the hairpiece who seems to be shy? How did this person come up with this idea? He takes the money and reinvests it, as you will in your own career, and he comes up with a place in Manhattan that he christens the Factory. And in that place, he's going to mass produce contemporary artworks, and it's given a name because other people are following suit. Klaus Oldenburg and a bunch of other people are doing very similar things, and they called it pop art because it was about popular art. And all of a sudden, pop art pushed the abstract expressionist painters like Willem de Kooning and Jackson Pollock. It pushed them out of the limelight, and it rushed in a new era of art. Willem de Kooning never did like pop art. He said it's not real art. Well, that's his opinion. It was hugely popular, folks. And lots of people were doing it, started doing it. And there's all sorts of documentaries out there. Hopefully, I'll find them and you guys will watch them and think about them because they're that important. I'm going to continue with Warhol later because I'm just taking it up to when he gets famous and gets the Factory, and all of a sudden, lots of people start coming to the Factory. Filmmakers and rock and roll stars like the Rolling Stones and Jim Morrison from the Doors, and Andy Warhol. There's a band in-house band called the Velvet Underground with Lou Reed and John Cale, Mo Tucker, and a blonde singer by the name of Nico. And rock and roll history is being changed. Warhol becomes their manager. It's New York City music. It's all about junkies and the femme fatale. It's downer, droney music. Nothing like the West Coast music of the Grateful Dead. In fact, Lou Reed hated all that hippie stuff. These guys weren't hippies. These were artists. New York City, they're tougher. They're different. Warhol became their mentor. He supported them for many years. He also started becoming a filmmaker. His films, once again, they were revolutionary because they're really not what you would call a film stories like you might have experienced in seeing a movie. He made movies 16 millimeter. He would never change the camera. He'd just aim it somewhere. It was mostly unscripted and improvised with actors and different forms of transgression and undress. He was a voyeur. If you know what I'm talking about, transgressive cinema, I'm going to talk about it a little later, not today. That's when they're showing bisexuality, homosexuality, transvestite, transsexuals. They're showing the underbelly of American sexual culture. Nobody had seen it before. He started to show this. And these films, some of them, one of his first movies is called Sleep. It's his boyfriend at the time, kind of a big burly guy, and he's sleeping. And Warhol filmed him for 8 hours, folks, sleeping. That's it. And in those days with 16 millimeter cameras, you had to reload the camera every 10 minutes. That's a lot of rolls of film. And nothing happens. Watch the movie. It's on YouTube. The guy sleeps. If you watch that for 8 hours, I'll be impressed. Anyway, he did another one called Empire State Building. He filmed the entire Empire State Building in 8 hours. He set the camera up on the street, aimed the camera at the building, pushed the button, and filmed it for 8 solid hours. It was a different form of storytelling. If you go in and out of it, which I have done, you see stuff. All of a sudden, you see stuff in the window. A light goes on, and you see a person in the office up there, and you're going, You start making the story up yourself. And that's the beauty of watching some of these things. You start having to think of your own story as you're watching a film that Warhol put together. Then he got together with another filmmaker, and they became, I'll talk about him later on when we do cinema. And then the films became more traditional in a way, with stories and people acting supposedly in them. And he created a whole stable of actors. He called them superstars, like Viva and Ultraviolet and many, many more. Edie Sedgwick, these they became his superstars. They were superstars in the underground cinema that Warhol promoted. These films never rarely played out in New York. They mostly played in art galleries or in underground screening rooms. They weren't down at your local mall. We didn't have malls in those days, thank God. But so later on, 19 Warhol got really famous. He got really very wealthy. I'm going to end his story just right now because I want to briefly talk about Basquiat before I just went on too long about Warhol. I'm actually reading a new book about Warhol, just came out, and I've read a lot of them, and there's always new information to be had. Like I said, I'm going to post some documentaries, watch them because your quiz is going to be based on them. The other person I want to talk about briefly right now is Jean Miguel Basquiat. He was not African American because his people came from the West Indies. He was born about 1960. He came up obsessed with Andy Warhol, wanting to be an artist. But how do you be an artist? He's really smart, intuitive kid. And so how he begins his art in the late 70s in New York, in the punk rock era of New York. He had a band also, not punk rock. They're kind of techno, I guess you'd call it. You can see clips of this on his documentaries. And he started to become a graffiti artist. He had no studio or way to get equipment. And so he took to the streets and he started doing interesting graffiti. And then he would sign it, Samo, Samo. And a lot of people thought it meant Samo. No, it just meant Samo. And he was saying, Samo, Samo. So like when someone tells you, how was your day? You go, same, Samo. It was his catchphrase for everything's the same, nothing changes. And well, people started going, who is this Samo? It's everywhere. What does he do? He also he wanted to meet Warhol very badly. And so he started painting these little cards, interesting paintings on these cards. And he was selling the cards for $3 or $4 a piece. He was mostly living hand in mouth. He was charming as hell, had a lot of girlfriends who were willing to take him in and try to clean him up and take care of him. And but he wants to meet Warhol, and so he has these cards, and he sees Warhol at a restaurant, and he approaches him with these cards, and Andy kind of digs the cards. He buys a couple. The cards are good, and that starts a relationship that lasts about 8 or 9 years, because by the late 80s, they were both dead. Andy from a gallbladder surgery that went wrong at 58 years old, I do believe, 57 in there, and Basquiat by heroin overdose at 27. Basquiat became famous in his time. His paintings tell the stories that he wanted to tell. When you watch the documentaries, when you research him, look at his paintings. Tell me what you think about him. He's using words on paintings. There's lots of words on poetry. He has a gift for language. He has a gift for constructing a story that pulls you right into it. You want to be involved in it. It's not just something that you think is cute, you move on, or something that's going to match your couch. That's why you buy it. It's not going to match your couch. Hopefully, you don't have a couch that looks like that. And they started selling huge in his lifetime. I mean, he did one showing of his stuff, and overnight he made $400,000. He went from having nothing to having so much cash he didn't know what to do with it. He lived with his girlfriend at the time, and he would hide cash everywhere. It was literally hidden. It'd be hidden behind the bookshelves. Yes, folks, people had books in those days. They'd be in the pages of books. She was always running into big wads of cash everywhere because he didn't trust banks, and so he didn't use the banks, and he had more money he didn't know what to do with. And he wasn't out buying cool cars. He didn't do any of that. He did get caught up in some major lifestyle stuff, mostly drugs, because he got depressed, especially heroin, which is a good drug for depression, folks, not to make you happy. You don't do heroin to be happy. You do it to ease the pain, numb your emotions. That came later in his career. He always dabbled in it, but now he had a boatload of money, could do whatever he wants. People wanted him. They wanted his them. They wanted his paintings. They wanted to know him. He was all of a sudden being pulled and pushed through the media. Famous painters like Julian Schnabel became his friend. Now, Julian Schnabel has never been really controversial, really, really successful painter, painting at the same time that Basquiat, really controlled. He knows what he's doing. He's older. He's a filmmaker now. He made a movie called Basquiat. His last movie was about Van Gogh. So he's a fiction filmmaker. His films are always worthwhile. His aesthetic is always worthwhile. And he's a good spokesman for what kind of went wrong with Basquiat. He was just a little too young to handle the fame. And also Warhol, they became so close that they were affiliated with each other. And a lot of people think Andy Warhol was parasiting off of Basquiat's fame. In a way, he was a little bit. Was he jealous of Basquiat's fame? Perhaps. Warhol's pretty rich by now himself, but he was kind of falling out of favor during this era. And Basquiat was not out of favor. He was very much into favor. And Warhol wanted to kind of be around that. Warhol had a tendency to find somebody like the Velvet Underground or Nico or Edie Sedgwick, and he would kind of use them to prop his image up in the media. And then when he's done with them, he kind of leaves them behind, which is not cool. But Andy and Basquiat needed each other. And then Andy went into the hospital with a bad gallbladder, which is relative simple operation. He had survived the surgery. He was going to feel better, and a nurse gave him the wrong medication, and it killed him. Basquiat was never the same after that. He swirled down into drug addiction, heroin addiction of the highest order. He couldn't really survive it, and he didn't. He was 27. Before Warhol had his gallbladder explode, he was also shot by an obsessed fan who wanted his attention, and a feminist woman who Warhol didn't give enough attention to. She came into the office, Valerie Solano, and she came in and she shot him about 3 times. And he shot somebody else too. Nobody died. She spent very little time in prison, folks, because she was crazy. I think she was in jail for about 3 years. That was it. Later on, she died of drug overdose. Andy never really survived. He survived the shooting, but he was never the same. The bullets pierced almost every major organ in his body. He had nothing but problems from then on out with his gallbladder, with his kidneys, with his spleen, because her bullets crisscrossed all these major arteries. And he always said, he died. That old Warhol died, and the new Warhol came into being. And he changed after that. He got security. You couldn't get to him like she did. You were not allowed to come up to his offices. He had bodyguards. The times had changed. And there's a brief Warhol and Basquiat. Watch the documentaries. Look for them. I'll post them up there. Look at them because your quizzes are going to be based on them. And on that note, go out and watch a painting. You could do a virtual tour of Modern Art Museum. You could virtual tour of Basquiat Museum. You could do a virtual tour of Warhol work. In fact, I hope you do that. I can't force you to do it. If we're in a room together, I would be putting this stuff on the projector. You'd be forced to watch it. But I can't do any of that. It's just, I hope that I inspire you to go look at this artwork, excuse me, to go look at this artwork and how it changed the American pop culture. And it's still changing us when it comes to fashion, celebrity. Warhol's famous quote was, "Everybody will eventually be famous for 15 minutes." And he said that 50 years ago. Think about it now, folks. Think about it now. People want more than 15 minutes. Look at YouTube. Tell me if people want to be famous for doing nothing. Just look at people who don't do anything. And you know who I'm talking about. Your beloved Kardashians or Paris Hiltons or whoever's popular right now. What do they do to earn their celebrity besides just being celebrities? Okay. That's it, folks. I will see you on the flip side. Stay safe out there. It's getting chilly, but it was a really nice, beautiful day today. But I feel fall is in the air. So maybe we'll get some moisture too. On that, keep rocking on the free world and start seeking out painters. You won't regret it. Till next time.